talk about manure application, risk management, tools and practices, what we've got going here. And just for those of you who I don't know or don't know very well, just a little brief bio of kind of where I've come from and what I do here. I received my bachelor's from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo down in California where I grew up. Please don't hold that against me. I am in Washington now. And in animal science, and then I did my master's at UC Davis in animal science with a specialty in nutrient management and environmental management. And then I went to Colorado State University and did my doctorate there, same topic, in animal science with a specialty in environmental management, aka nutrient management with a specialty in air quality. And I bring that up because in the process of learning about air, I also had to learn about water and soil and crops and the whole shebang. You have to think of everything in a systems approach. And you guys know this. If you do something one place really, really well, you may see a negative impact up the line or down the line. It's kind of the balloon effect, right? If you squeeze one end, it inflates on another. So just fixing something one place isn't fixing the whole system. So looking at things in a holistic approach on your farm or environmentally or however it may be, that's pretty important. So I've been here at the district for about 4 years now, and my primary, I do some nutrient management planning, some dairy planning, but for the most part, my job is to design tools and practices to make things better and easier for you to make better decisions, more informed decisions, and also bring you these types of educational opportunities to increase your understanding and knowledge about certain topics so that you can make better decisions. So today what I'm going to talk about is all the different tools that we have developed over the last couple of years and where those are progressing and how you can utilize them in your day-to-day for your nutrient and or manure management. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the current rules and regulations with manure spreading. You already know these, but I just want to set the stage for a brief review on these things. How we want to see the guidance actually kind of morph and change and what's going to be more effective for better nutrient management and better and more flexibility for you, for the farmer. Some of the tools and practices that we have developed. Agronomic rate, just talk about that a little bit and how that sets the stage for everything that we do. Our Manure Spreading Advisory, our Application Risk Management System, the revised Manure Application Setbacks and the flexibility that's going to now provide. And of course we've got a new dairy plan format that we're just rolling out for folks. So we've got 2 different types of plan updates now. And we've got more accessible information for you for those things. So I'll talk a little bit about that and have plenty of time for discussion and questions at the end. However, as I go through and something doesn't make sense or you want me to elaborate or clarify something, please feel free to raise your hand or just interrupt, and I'm happy to diverge as we go along. So just a brief overview. What are our program goals at the district for this program, and what are we doing? Well, in general, our job is to help you reduce your leaching, emission, runoff, pollution events, in other words. The environmental piece is probably last on your list, so we're trying to help you meet those guidelines and regulations that Department of Ecology, Department of Ag, EPA, etc. put out, but in a manageable way on your farm that you can actually better your yields, hopefully, increase your production, your efficiency, and your management with these things. So we're actually trying to bridge the gap between what you do on farm, what you're required to do, and actually make things better on both ends. So that's the majority of the goal that we're trying to do, and preserve agriculture in our state, and more importantly in this community, which it was built on here in Whatcom County. So trying to maintain that in our county, where we see every year fewer and fewer farmers for one reason or another. So in the push that you guys all experience with new regulations, tighter regulations, etc., trying to just manage all those things together. So let's kind of do a brief overview. What are current manure application guidelines? Well, all of you should know these hopefully by heart, but we'll just review them just in case. So the majority of you, the stop date for manure application, this was set by the a handful, year 98 or so, via a couple of different practices, the manure ordinance, good guidance in your management plans, to stop application for everybody October 31st, October 15th if you live in the floodplain. And that one is important, actually, the October 15th, because that was set on 30 days prior to the estimated annual flood time. So you want 30 days of absorption before you're in a flooded area. The start date for application has typically been something called TSUM 200 and or February 15th. So for those of you, the TSUM 200 has actually changed from its original purpose. It was originally just a guideline to figure out when you could start applying nutrients or when it was needed for your forage growth. So as it started to grow around these units in the TSUM 200, the T is temperature, SUM is the gross accumulation of temperature units between the average between the low and the high for starting January 1 until you reach 200. And when you hit that marker, then it said, well, now you can start putting out nutrients your crops are going to need them about. But it's actually become far more of like, oh, when's that date? I need to get my lagoons full. I just need to get out there and, you know, whatever it is. It's just some arbitrary date someone put out. So these things have kind of morphed and they've lost a lot of their relevance over time due to different management. And I'm not saying everyone, I'm just talking kind of in general. And then, as you know, the Whatcom Manure Ordinance, that was put out quite a long time ago, over 10 years ago, so 98-ish. It said no application to corn ground between September 1st and March 15th, which is pretty common, or bare ground. And so that's a pretty darn good guideline, actually. And we've kind of morphed, actually. Now we've got cover crops and various things that now kind of fall into this gray area, and how do we deal with that? And then other than that, if you are going to spread outside of these dates, you need to have that said in your nutrient management plan, which all of you have by law. Everyone's required to have a nutrient management plan. Has it been updated in a while? Who knows? What's in there? Who knows for some folks? Where is it? Who knows for some folks? So this is, again, so all of these things have kind of spurred us. Let's find a new way to utilize some of these things. Let's do things better and give farmers individual flexibility for their farms. And we did that because some of these dates can allow or encourage poor application. As I mentioned, that February 15th date, just because it's February 15th, doesn't mean necessarily you should be out there. Maybe it was before February 15th you should have been out there. Maybe it's a little bit after. If it's pouring rain or your fields are still saturated, those can encourage poor application practices and lead to runoff events, which is something you don't want to have to deal with. They also don't allow for adjustments for, you know, our changing climate and weather patterns that we get every year. That kind of shift, and wow, we had a really nice January I just watched go by, and then it rained from February 1st until April, kind of a thing. So it doesn't allow for adjustment of those things. And it doesn't require you guys to actually look at risk factors, to have more touch with what's the weather looking like, what are my agronomic rates, what's happening out in my field, what's saturated. Doesn't allow you really to be in touch with some of those things on a different level. You probably know this stuff intrinsically, like, I know if I get my tractor out there, it's probably okay. But why? So just trying to, let's get just in touch with those little things for a little while so that you can make better informed decisions on your own very quickly. And the dates don't allow you to differentiate between field characteristics. Some of your fields, yeah, they're wet and they're saturated for a long time. Some people have really dry, high-dry fields, and you could be out there in a totally different way. So these dates don't allow for that variability in the field conditions that you may have. So what do we want to do? So we wanted to create a set of tools and guidelines and measures and a program such that you can eliminate these rigid application dates and apply when it's appropriate, how it's appropriate, and at appropriate rates. So everything that kind of lines up and give you the tools to do that. You can customize the application guidance by your farm and by the field, so everyone may have a different program. Just because your neighbor's applying doesn't mean it's okay for you. So it's kind of everyone should have a customized manure application schedule for their appropriate conditions in fields. This may mean that you may have an opportunity to apply on some of your fields in January, and you may need to stop applying on some of your fields in September. So these things may affect your storage, and I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. So those are kind of the way that we want to give you guys flexibility and guidance to do a better job on your own. So how did we develop this new guidance? Well, we just thought about, okay, what are the main things that cause a pollution event? Leaching or runoff. Runoff being our number one, since that's what's highly regulated and measured at this point. And leaching being also important. Let's look at that one. So obviously pollutant availability. So if it's out there and it's not being taken up by your plants, it's available to move if given the opportunity. Things like nitrogen can do that more readily in one way versus phosphorus in another. I'll talk about that here in a minute. So you want to think about those things. Improper application practices and or grazing practices, what did the timing, the method, the rate, looking at all those things and making sure that those are appropriate and lined up. If not, you're going to have potential for a pollution event. Weather events, so our precipitation obviously is a big one around here that creates those issues. Flooding, saturated soils, wind drift if you're using a big gun. These are considerations that we wanted to incorporate into tools. As well as your field conditions. If you have a challenging soil type, for instance, here's an interesting thing actually. The soil types that are going to have the least potential for a runoff event are going to have the greatest potential for leaching event, because they're probably your sandy soils. So that nitrate, if it's not taken up by your crops, it's going to be able to leach right down, but it's not going to run off. So we have to look at the trade-offs there and apply appropriately at the right time so that we don't have those losses, but we can still maximize your yields and growth rates. So looking at all those things is very important. So we picked out, so you want to apply the right source, so using the right type of fertilizer, whether that's chemical fertilizer at one part of the year, your solids or your liquids, your thick stuff, your thin stuff, all those things make a difference and apply and should be used at different times of the year. The amount you put on, are you putting on a heavy amount of volume or a heavy amount of concentration at different times of the year? So we want to account for that. The timing, so syncing up, timing of your nutrient availability with your crop needs. And this is a little challenging with manure because manure isn't like chemical fertilizer you put out and it's ready to go. Manure you put out and it could be a month or 2 months or 3 months before those nutrients are ready. So we want to match the crop growth with when you put it out so that those two things kind of coincide very readily and your plant can take everything up really well. And then placement. Where do we want to put this in the field? Do we have a buffer for corn? Are you putting it in the rows? Are you putting it next to the rows? You're just doing the whole field. You can do different portions. Last month, Shabtai Bittman talked a bit about alternative corn applications, using thick slurry actually right in the rows instead of a starter fertilizer, and they found good results with that. So you can be creative with the ways that you use different portions of your manure if you start thinking about it like a really valuable product. So the 4 things I want to talk about today, the tools and guidance, is agronomic application and manure spreading advisory, our application risk management system, and manure application setbacks distances. So the first one is agronomic application. And this is pretty simple. Agronomics is basically applying nutrients at the right rate and timing to match crop needs. So you have what's available out in the field. And this can be either your current or future. So you have to think about when I put it out there, what's available now for my plant, and then what will become available as it comes out. So this is mineralization in your soil from previously applied manure. It's what you just put out there. And that minus your plant needs is what the additional you need to put out. And again, this is the same. What's available now, what's going to come available. And the balance here is important. If this is out of balance and you put on too much nutrients, then you're going to have either too much soil nutrients available out there and your plant will be overbearing and you're going to lose from that piece. Or you're going to have, if this is not applied enough, then what's available won't match your needs and you're going to have more need than you have available. So it's a challenge to kind of work that up. Something like the fall nitrate test should be used to help you as a report card to say, what do I have left on there? If it's a very, very low number, either you did a great budget or maybe that's just an indication that you were a little tight and we need to change it for the next year. If you have a lot left over, again, maybe, wow, I put way more out than I needed, I wasted a valuable product. I can dial this back a little bit next year. So using that as a tool to help you figure that out is very important. And the difference here on this out of balance is agronomics is the difference between waste disposal and nutrient management. So if you're trying to match up this agronomic need, you're doing nutrient management. If you're just putting all your manure out at the end of October because you're trying to maximize your storage, that's waste disposal. So that's not agronomic for the most part. In some cases it can be. A lot of times it isn't necessarily. So this is something that we just need a little more thought on. And we're in the process of actually putting a quick agronomic calculator tool on our website to help you kind of figure this out, something that could be used on a mobile phone, etc. So there are some tools out there here and there, but we'd like to kind of get one that's readily available for you guys and customized for our area. So this is something that agronomics is something you have to figure out on the fly. How much have I put out there? What's left? And this is where your soil tests and your manure tests come into play to help you figure those things out. Your manure tests, if you haven't changed a lot on farm, over time they're going to be pretty much similar throughout the year. Or year to year, what's going to change is the dilution factor. So obviously in the spring you're going to have a lot more dilution, a lot more water in there. So 1,000 gallons of nutrient concentration in the fall versus the spring is going to be different. So just paying attention to that, just because you put 1,000 gallons out, you may have twice as much nitrogen out in the fall than you do in the spring. So considering those things is very important. Manure nutrient availability. Let's just pick out the two big ones, nitrogen and phosphorus. So nitrogen is it's an amazing compound. It's all over the place. Nitrogen can be lost to the groundwater, can be lost to surface water, can be lost to the air in various forms, and it's also what your plant needs the most, and it's what the soil really works on converting. It nitrifies, it denitrifies, it mineralizes, it immobilizes. It's all over the place. It's pretty amazing. Something like phosphorus, not as much. Phosphorus, once you put it on, it's there, and it doesn't leach down into the ground like nitrate will. It actually will go off in sediment transport. So this is where we're concerned about losses, like on a barren field or corn crop that's been harvested and you get a lot of rain or flooding. That's where you lose a lot of that, is through that sediment loss. So phosphorus, because of the way that it's lost, and your plant only takes up so much, it will accumulate in your soil. So this is important to consider when we look at our nitrogen to phosphorus balance. So if you're applying your nitrogen in a way that you're getting a lot of ammonia volatilization losses, that means that your nitrogen to phosphorus ratio is out of balance, and you're just going to keep building phosphorus at a rate on your field that your nitrogen's not matching. So you want to make sure that when you're putting your nitrogen out there, you are absolutely conserving as much as you possibly can. You're utilizing as much as you possibly can so that you can keep that nutrient balance in kind of appropriate out there, in the ratio that you want to have out there. And so this is just kind of a schematic of nitrogen. So manure nitrogen comes out in two forms. It's about 50-50 of organic nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. This ammonium nitrogen is the piece that can be utilized by plants or is converted to nitrate by nitrification and then utilized by your plants as well. Organic nitrogen takes a little bit longer. So this is where we have mineralization. This is kind of that. We look at so much is available season 1, so you maybe have 60% and then 30%, 10%. So it may kind of go down the line there, what's available. So it has to mineralize to that ammonium nitrogen and convert for plant available. So if this ammonium nitrogen is not incorporated or it's not utilized, this is where you get your losses as ammonia nitrogen and the volatilization. The nitrate piece, if this is overwhelmed, so if we've got too much conversion here and not enough uptake, this is what's lost via leaching, or if you've got a saturated soil, it's lost by denitrification. So instead of, as ammonium goes volatilizes as ammonia, nitrate will volatilize as nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. So we lose it in a different way. So that's just as important to consider. So this is kind of that balance that you want to think about. Where is it going and what time of year and what causes those things? We're looking at soil organisms doing the work. Are we looking at aerobic versus anaerobic? Aerobic being lots of oxygen or dry soils. Anaerobic being no oxygen or really saturated soils. How am I losing things? So now let's kind of think about forage nutrient uptake. When are things taken up by the soil? What are the growth rates, and when do we want to put manure on to account for that? So this is a general grass growth curve for our area. So you can see starting January, we don't have a lot of growth. You can see this is percent of total growth a month along this axis. And it starts going up a little bit in February, starting March, April, May, when we start warming up a little bit, as you all know. The grass growth really goes up. And then we and sometimes it'll continue in June depending on our year. But after that, when it starts getting really warm or your soils start drying off, that production really goes up. If you irrigate, you can increase that somewhat so that you're still retaining production. But really, after September, we may get a little spike, and then it's just your crop is not really taking much up. And we heard actually in Steve Franson's talk, this is about the time that your plants aren't putting growth up, they're putting growth down into the root structure, and that's what we want to encourage. So when you apply, if you think about when you should be providing nutrients for your grass at the right time to match its needs, we think about if you put manure out in the wintertime when the soils are cold. So when soil is below 40 degrees, those microbes are relatively dormant, and we're not getting conversion of that nitrogen into the nitrate plant usable form. It's when we get over 40 degrees do we have that. So if we put manure out in January, for instance, its conversion rate is going to really well match up this growth rate so that you're going to have an equal kind of availability with uptake if we get out in that early season. If we get behind that, let's say we're putting out in February, March, it still may match because you're still going to have the warmth and conversion will be a little bit faster here, but you're going to miss that early window that you can maximize your yields in that first cutting. If you've got the soil to do it. As we start putting it out here, we're still going to get fine conversion. It's when we start putting it out here. If you put manure out in September or October, the soil is still warm. We're not getting below 40 degrees until out here in December or so. So conversion is still rapid. Your soil is dry enough that it's actually going to be a positive increase. And you're not going to have the uptake that you have. So this is where we run into an issue that if we're applying out here, we're going to have more available than we are utilizing our plant uptake. So this is where we kind of run into a challenge with losing it via nitrate leaching, because we all know that once it starts raining in November, when you come back and if you did a nitrate test here, there's nothing left. So we usually lose it all from denitrification, volatilization, or with nitrate leaching during that winter time period. So something to think about with your grass growth. And this will change, as I said, if you have a very saturated soil and you know you can't get out till June, then our management here becomes a little bit different. We can do some creative things on this end of things, such that with solids and various things, that once come around, that conversion will still be there for you. So there are creative ways that you can get around no matter what your soil type is. Cover crops as well. So if you are going to plant a cover crop on your cornfield, I should say when you plant a cover crop on your cornfield, because we encourage everyone to do that. It's a very good practice for reducing your loss of sediment so you don't clog up your ditches, you're not losing nutrients. You can also take up all that excess nitrogen so that it's not lost in your system. And with the economy the way it is, having an extra source of forage is really, really nice. That's basically an extra cutting or two bang for your buck. So if you're going to have a cover crop on your field, and if you're going to harvest it, you can get out in that early season and get manure on there if it's necessary, if you can show it's agronomic, to get an extra boost. So this is a way to get out earlier on extra acres when you apply or when you're utilizing a cover crop. There's no application, as says in the manure ordinance, and we still maintain that, there is no application on bare fields in the winter that have nothing growing on them, or that flood or saturate, or that are right next to a ditch. We don't want to see that because you're definitely going to have transport losses and runoff on that, no problem. So that's something we don't want to see. For corn, it's a bit different, and for corn, you're kind of putting out a little bit before things get started, and it's a challenge around here with our growing degree days and getting our soil warm and getting things started. It can be a bit of a challenge. So injection or immediate incorporation is the best because you can limit your losses, and as that soil warms up, hopefully it matches what the corn needs. People usually use a little starter fertilizer to get things going. You can use different segments of your manure to get the same thing as I mentioned earlier. And actually we've got a handful of different manuals available. So just if you're interested in these, you can grab one or both of these on your way out. So advances in corn silage management and advances in forage management, both of these were put out across the border by BC, but they're all based on our conditions here. And they're extremely valuable things. It's very easy to read, some fantastic information on everything that I'm kind of talking about here in the last handful of slides. And they're really amazing publications. And they talk about what's the best management, how do you use all these tests that we ask you to do and that you're doing that you may not know what to do with. So it's a really great way to kind of figure all that out. So when you're applying solids versus liquids, this is important to consider too. Solids has nitrogen in it, but a lot less, and it's a lot less available. And most of the time, the solids that you put out either has a lot of carbon in it from your sawdust, from your bedding, or just from all the feed that wasn't digested, all the lignin that comes through the animal's digestive system and is available. so that if you have too much carbon in there, you can actually tie up the nitrogen in your soil. The carbon likes to hold on to nitrogen and it doesn't let it go. So it's not available. So that takes a long time to mineralize. So having too much carbon out there can actually be a negative. It may just tie up too much of your nitrogen and you don't want that. So that's something to consider. You have about 5 to 20% nitrogen in those solids, more like 50% when you put liquids out there. So depending on what your goal is and what you're trying to do, your solid versus liquid manure application will kind of get you where you want to go and how quickly you want that nitrogen available out there. And as I mentioned, kind of conversion can take a little while. And in corn and any crop, actually, you want to account for that mineralization, what's coming back from last year. So having that in that equation. And we usually help you with that when we do our nutrient budget. We think about all those things and what you have is kind of credits coming in and what you need going out. So the second thing I want to talk about, so that's agronomics. Think about when we apply, how much you need, and when you should apply, and those types of things. This is the first tool we have available, our Manure Spreading Advisory. And this is on our website. If you go to our website, the front page over on the right-hand side, big red, says Manure Spreading Advisory. And this is essentially your first line of defense for should I put manure out today or not? And how can I plan out a few days to look at this? So I pulled this from yesterday, so yes, it's red. If the risk is high, don't apply. It's kind of a bad time. I think everyone can agree with that. But as we go into our more risky times of the year and seasons, this is a great indicator because if you click on where you live, what you'll get is a 24-hour predictive forecast for 5 days out, as well as the 72-hour predictive forecast. And this is what we're really concerned about. This is, like today, we may only get 0.1 or 0.01 inches, but you may have an inch tomorrow. So just because there isn't a lot of precip today doesn't mean we're not concerned about a couple of days out, because you're going to have just as much of a potential for having a runoff event and vice versa. So for instance, if our risk is high today, you may see a few days out, the risk is actually going down, it's going to be low. So you have a few days to plan your application timing. So this is a great tool just as a starter. Just go here first, look at the map, it's color-coded, it either says yay or nay. And if it says yay, continue on with the rest of your analysis. If it says nay, go to something else and wait a day. So this is kind of your first line of defense. On this page as well, we've got the current manure setback distance, and I'll come back to what this means, as well as spreading guidance. So here's where I'll update this textually every day when I'll say a big front's coming in, wait a few days, or a big clearance coming, keep watching this advisory, and and you can find that right day. So this is just general, as I mentioned, each field is different. So this is just kind of, as I said, your first line of defense, and then we go to a field-by-field evaluation after this. So there's a lot of information up here for you. And you can access this from a mobile device. So we've optimized it for that, so you can check it on your smartphone or tablet, etc. So now is the third thing I want to talk about. This is Application Risk Management, or ARM as I'm going to call it. So this is a new system that we've been developing, we've been testing for the last couple of years, and we have a little bit more to go before we're optimizing it. And this is basically a system that is going to help you address and minimize chances for runoff and groundwater leaching and emissions. But what we're finding, even more than just having that protective impact, is that we're actually seeing better yield results by using custom manure application timing and rates on each of your fields. So it's really like precision farming with manure in a sense, with accounting for these other aspects. So we've seen some great results so far, and so this system looks at, as I mentioned, each of your fields and every day. So it accounts for a very real-time dynamic aspect to your manure management. It also gives you more accountability. So some people may like, most people actually should like this, some may be nervous about it, but it gives you more responsibility, at the same time more flexibility to do better manure application and more custom for your land and your conditions. So it can go either way. And it assists with the application during high-risk times. So we want this as something you do every day for every application, but this is also a system that if you are in an emergency situation where for some reason, from poor water management, etc., your lagoon is full, and it is December or January or some odd time and you have to get out, you can use the system to figure out the least impactful place and the best guidance on how to do that. So that also plays very well into this. Hopefully you will never have to use it, but I know everybody has or may will at some point. So the first part of this is doing a field-by-field risk assessment. And we look at a ton of different factors for each of your fields. We do this kind of a soil evaluation, and then we go out with you and we look at those fields. We find the low spots, the ponding spots, the issue spots, the high spots, the dry spots, etc. So we really map out each of your fields, and you guys know this stuff by heart, and then we can just help document it and put it all together. And some examples, what's a high-risk field versus a low-risk versus the medium. For instance, a low-risk field is going to be a grass field with no water around it, probably a very good infiltration rate, and good available water holding capacity, so it doesn't get saturated. That's a low-risk field. It sounds like low risk, right? You probably get out there every day. A medium risk field is going to be somewhere in the middle. Maybe there's some water nearby, and maybe you get a little ponding. There's still pretty good infiltration, and you don't really have too much of a slope. So it's kind of a mix of things, whereas like a high-risk field is going to be a field that is either, it's bare ground most of the time in the wintertime. It floods. It's all surrounded by water everywhere. You have a swale. There's some very special consideration areas. Those are high-risk fields. So, and what we do, and I don't expect you to read this at all, don't worry, but this is kind of what it looks like. We do a soil type, field by field, and we end up with all of these different colors and various things, and we know how many acres of each type you have, of high risk and low risk, and then we can tell you how many acres you have for higher risk application times, aka mostly that early season. Do you have fields available for January, February application so that you know how to manage your storage a little bit better, and you can kind of shift back, stopping application in September on some of those fields that you're going to just be losing manure to, and get out earlier where you're going to gain yields and use your manure a lot better. So what you receive, what makes sense to you, is you get essentially you get a map. So here's just a handful of different maps of farms that we've done. Some will have mostly high risk, maybe some mediums. Some will have a lot of low risk, really well usable fields. Some in floodplains and other areas have a lot of challenging, and some you can have a 50-50 mix of everything. So depending on where you're at, it really depends on how your risk comes out. But you can see we've split fields, so you have part of it that's good or not. So this is kind of what your map would look like. And what you do with this, so once you say, okay, I've got some low-risk fields, and I want to get out to those in January. And you start watching that manure spreading advisory, and it says the risk is, it's getting on the low side. You say, all right, I'm ready to go. So now what you want to do is look at, you want to fill out our application risk management worksheet. And this is available, it's an Excel spreadsheet, so you can just have it on your computer and be able to fill it out anytime. And what it basically, and again, I don't expect you to read this, it's a lot in a small space, and unfortunately we don't have the web and I can't pull it up. But, what's on here is, number one, you enter in all this stuff right here is the forecast information. So in this, we're getting to the point where this will auto-fill, so you have less to fill in here. But it's basically asking you, how much precip have we received in the last 3 days? Because this will be an indicator of your potential soil saturation. And then how much are we going to have the day of application and the few days after? So it's okay, it's actually good to have a little bit of rain the day of application. I'm talking about a 1/10 of an inch or less, especially if you're broadcast applicating on grass fields, because it will actually take the manure off the leaf surface and get it right into that top layer. It's not enough to make anything run off, it's just enough to get it down, and so we're not having more, or when it's on the leaf surface, you're going to increase in volatilization losses, so that potential goes down. So a little bit all day is okay. We don't want, if it's more than 1/2 inch, no apply. It'll override you right there and say wait. The second thing we want you to look at is assessing those individual fields. What's the depth to water? In other words, if you've got a water table that's within a foot or less, you can't be out there. Whatever you put in is going to have the potential just to kind of shimmy right down there. You've lost it below the root zone. It's not necessary. So you want to make sure the water table's below, and you can usually, you either know it by a creek or a ditch or something nearby, or there's other ways you can figure it out. Also looking at your soil saturation, so your soil moisture percentage. If you get a tractor out there, you're probably just fine. If you go out and you see water squishing as you're walking, don't go out in that field. So you're going to have compaction issues and some other problems. So evaluating that, we give you a bunch of tools on our website on how to figure those things out, and/or it's in your plan information. And then looking at, do you have frozen fields or ponding or all those types of things, and those are more of just special considerations. If we have frozen more than an inch down, what you put on the surface is likely going to move, so that's an obvious no-go. Snow is the same way, so we want to avoid those kinds of things. And then your vegetative cover, if you've got a dense cover and you put out there, that water is going to not move as much. It's going to hit each of those stems and leaf surfaces. It's going to keep slowing it down and give it a greater chance for infiltrating. If you have a sparse cover, 70% or 50% or less, that water is going to be able just to move and your manure with it right off and somewhere else. So you want to make sure that you've got a nice dense cover, so that's good field management. If you've had crop die-off for some reason, that actually goes back to maybe you put too late or put on manure too late in the season and you encourage more upgrowth than root growth. So that could be an indication there, but if you have a lot of dead stuff out there as well, that's a no-go. You don't want to put out on a dead crop. And then the next one is the application equipment that you're going to use. So are you using an injector or a broadcast, or are you using a big gun? So all those things matter quite a bit on the guidance that we'll give you. And then lastly are looking at, do you have protective measures in place? Do you have a permanent vegetative filter strip on there? Or are you just using manure setback guidance instead? And if so, what are you using at that time period? So this is just a double check to make sure that everything's kosher. And in the end, what this gives you is an overall risk for applying to that field or cluster of fields on that day. So based on those conditions, if it's medium or low risk, you're good to go. If it's a high risk, try it again tomorrow. So this is a way to there's a few benefits to this. The first one is to document what you've done. Let's say you're applying on January 10th because conditions are great, your field's good to go, you did this and you're out. Someone drives by and says, what in the world is going on here? Or a neighbor complains or whatever. You say, wait a second. Here is all of the steps I did. Here's the guidance I followed through. I'm on this program. You're fine. So you have the documentation to show that it was agronomic, it was okay, and you're protected. So this is a way for you to kind of defend yourself, if you will, for your good practices you're doing. So as this becomes more and more common and more people are on this, that'll be less of an issue. But in the beginning, it just is what it is. And I probably have about a dozen folks who are kind of pilot testing this with me at the current moment, and it helps to have those sheets because I'll get calls. Is so-and-so okay? I said, yeah, they did everything they're supposed to do. It's all right. So it's a good way to keep in touch with that as well, and helps you with your record keeping. So this is an easy way to just write how much you put on the bottom, and you can use this for your application record keeping and showing all the things that you're now going to be required under the new record keeping legislation to account for. And as I mentioned, yeah, in the end, you want to send a copy to me before you apply. If it's a very high risk time, just so I can kind of double check for you if you want to do that and be able to back you up on things. So what are the limiting factors? As I already kind of mentioned a lot of these. If we have too much rain, it'll say stop. If your soil moisture is too high, stop. If your water table is too high, stop. So there are a lot of things in here that will tell you stop. And you may say, well, what in the world, or at the end, there may have been nothing that told you to stop, but it may come out high risk. And when you do that, let's say this comes out medium or high risk and you couldn't understand why, well, you can go back to this column and it gives a risk rating for each one of those, and you may find one of those things that was really high, and maybe you can mitigate for that. Or you can kind of understand it a little bit better and maybe try things a little different on your field for the following year to account for that. So that's kind of a way to look at those things. And so I kind of talked about all those things. I want to talk a little bit about this winter manure application guidance, because a lot of times we talk about this high risk and June, this whole system is relevant and you should be doing all this every application all year round, but it's not going to be nearly as high of a risk as if someone wants to apply in the wintertime. So this is a handful of guidance that has been around. NRCS put this out in 2005, and we've utilized this on special consideration for folks. And all the programs that we're developing kind of came out of this. But just a few things that you have to also consider is that you have to make sure that you're complying with your soil testing, that those things are up to date, and that's for that agronomics piece. And that you've got those areas mapped to show those area of applications and those limitations that are out there. that you're following your setback distances, and that would be 80 feet, and that's setback from any area that we consider a problematic, potential problems, so waterways, swales, etc. And then there's a lot of things. So you shouldn't be applying in January if your fall soil nitrate was high. Well, in that case, you would actually want to measure it before you apply to see, well, was I over 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre? So there's probably enough out there already. And this is typical with our cover crops, which is why you don't need to apply when you put it on, because there's typically quite a bit left over from those late season applications. But as we kind of start getting better and better at that, this may be something that we won't have to deal with as much. We'll actually need more applications at specific times for these alternative crops. And the rest is the same: frozen, saturated, flooded fields, etc. So all of these things kind of corroborate with what we have as kind of thresholds in our spreadsheet. And all those thresholds I talked about, so these things, when we say stop and how the spreadsheet calculates what's high risk and what's not, all of those things are what we're currently field testing and adjusting all the time to make sure they're just right. We don't want them too onerous, we don't want them too soft, we want them Goldilocks, we want them just right. So we've got 2 systems we're testing conventional, so this kind of February 15th through October 31st system, and then our alternative system, looking at custom application on split fields, so that we can see what's better. Are we seeing a difference? Does our new system have a negative impact or a positive impact? These are really important for us to bring this to you, to actually sell this, if you will, or convince you this is a good idea. And we're doing a lot of monitoring and assessment and validation on fields in the county, looking at all this. We've got a ton of stuff we're looking at. We look at soil samples, the manure and forage, and surface water, groundwater, soil water, air, meteorological conditions, so we can look at the combinations and connections and correlations between all of these things to see maybe it's possible for you just to measure one thing and be able to predict all the others, or those types of things. That's how we determine what goes in that worksheet, by looking at how are these things connected and how can one do the other, so that we're giving you the easiest to use tool, but also accounts for everything that you need to know. So as I said, the goal is to optimize your personal application strategies and guidance. And this is what kind of some of that equipment looks like out there. We actually have groundwater wells alongside of, these are called lysimeters, and this has a permeable top in it, and as the water comes through the soil, it collects in that bucket, and then the tubing, as you can see, comes up from all these buckets to the surface, and we can sample out of them. So we've been able to see at 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 feet, which is basically the bottom of your leach field, what is actually lost below that at what time of year and why. So that we can say, okay, it was because of this type of irrigation practices, or rain during this time because of this. So we're able to give you really customized knowledge of what we found. And then looking at soil profiles, etc., to look at what you've got down there. So this wouldn't be needed to do any of this. This is just what we're doing to test and validate under a research project. So you don't have to have all of this to do this kind of guidance. One back. So some of the preliminary findings that we found with our project so far is that this, makes sense. So nutrient concentration gradient changes with depth. But what's important is when. So we have a lot of nitrate in soils in that top level certain times a year, and then we can actually just watch it go down. But what we found is different soil types have different losses. So your really saturated soil type that either groundwater comes all the way up, or it's a high amount of clay, etc., that doesn't lose down this way. It's actually the water table comes up and maybe collects and takes back down. Whereas if you have a very sandy, gravelly soil, those are the ones that we've got movement or loss of nitrogen through the soil type via the precipitation pushes it down. So different soil types, actually, some we're not really concerned about nitrogen losses via nitrate leaching. We're far more concerned about your runoff losses from saturation. So it's very interesting. We've been able to document those two things with the data that we've collected, which helps us support when you put manure out certain times of the year on different soil types. We've also found obviously a seasonal effect on concentration. This has to do with the soil saturation and the soil temperature are the two biggest factors of what's converting and when and how. We've even seen very interesting results with phosphorus, and how with time of year you measure it and what type of soil you have determines what response you actually get back, what those lab tests say. We've also found your pH has a really big factor in all this. You probably already knew that from crop growth. You don't want a low pH necessarily, but actually a low pH, you'll still have a lot of nitrogen, but it's all going to be in more the organic or nitrate form, not the ammonium form. If it can't convert that, acidic soil actually holds your nitrogen in the ammonium form and it won't convert over. So it almost like ties it all up, and you're like, well, there is no nitrate out here, but I've got all this total nitrogen, where the heck is it? So that's also important to consider about understanding what ties up and where things go. So your soil test can tell you a lot of really cool stuff, and how deep you take it can tell you a lot as well. So these are things just to become more familiar with and utilize a little bit better. As I mentioned, the soil types have different transport characteristics, so whether the water goes down or comes up affects how and when we lose it and how much. And you've got denitrification in saturated soils where your water table comes up. That's not nitrate. So it's actually, we're losing it in a different way, or it just waits around for you until spring. So it's very interesting. Still a lot of unknowns and questions to be answered. And I think that's probably, as a researcher, that's a lifetime thing, but we've got so much really interesting stuff we're still collecting and knowing. So with this, a handful of just guidance on application practices based on what we found. So application of liquid manure, injection or aeration is best at higher risk seasons or high risk times. The aeration is nice because you can't really inject on a grass field without ruining it, but taking those plugs out helps the manure kind of get in just a little bit, and you don't have that runoff issue. So if you're going to apply in the early season, that's the best method to do it. The big gun, you'll drag it because you don't want to get a tractor out and compact your fields, and I can appreciate that. So in some fields, that's going to be the way to do it. But if you can, the aerator's best, and of course with corn, you always want to inject it and get it into that soil and fluff that up. And if you do apply with the big gun, it's very easy to apply, to over-apply if it's not being pulled right, or to have drift issue. And that's where you can get pockets where you have too much manure applied in one area, and you're going to have odd yields or color differences, and those types of things is what you'll see. And then of course, with liquid manure, it's really important to follow application setback guidance for that time of year. Very important for that, so that we can minimize the potential for having surface runoff losses. Application of solid manure. So you can apply, if you're going to put out solid manure any time of the year, you want to obviously spread it pretty thin. And this applies for cover crops during the kind of winter time, when you can put out. A lot of people pile in fields though. I mean, you see this everywhere. So you'll kind of, for your solid storage, it's getting full, or you just want to get it out on a cornfield so it's there for your ease of use and spreading in the springtime. Well, if you're going to do that, the bigger the pile, the better. You don't want to put a lot of small piles out there, and that's for a couple reasons. A small pile has a larger surface area. And if you have a larger surface area, you're going to have more ammonia volatilization losses. So you're losing your nitrogen, but you still have all that carbon and phosphorus in there. So you're just losing your nitrogen to the air. And so your ratio's off, it's going to tie it up, it's not going to be as available as you want it. If you have a really big pile, you have less total surface area, less of that is available to be lost as ammonia volatilization. In addition, your bottom footprint is going to be smaller too, so you're going to have less of a runoff potential. You're not really going to have a big leaching issue if you put this stuff out on more saturated soil types that aren't going to have that leaching potential. We do not recommend that you apply or pile solids in the wintertime on well-drained soils, because you are going to get plenty of loss down. So it's that interface, it's that when you think about the anaerobic and aerobic, so oxygen or no oxygen. If there's oxygen, you're going to have conversion to nitrate and or ammonia volatilization. And that's when you have no water. If you have no oxygen, that's when it's saturated with water. That's when we don't have those volatilization or nitrate conversion losses. So it's a little bit counterintuitive maybe, or maybe not. Maybe that makes perfect sense. So you want to pile this on fields that are going to saturate, but you cannot pile this, any kind of solids, on fields that are in a floodplain. We do not want runoff. You don't want to put it within 100 feet of a water body or anywhere that will slope and collect and drain into a water body. Here's a great example of that. Someone was storing solids on both sides of this. This is, it's hard to see in the picture, but this is all flooded right here. So this is a constructed wetland. This is also a ditch. All of this is just running that way. This is Skagit, by the way. So I wouldn't dare do that. I'm just kidding. But so you can get a lot of, this is very poor storage. So you're going to have a lot of losses that way. You don't want to put the stuff within a certain distance of wells or other things, or as I mentioned, on a slope to a water body, or near a neighbor who doesn't want to see it. So it just, those are really practical, obvious things. But the most important things are don't have this anywhere in a floodplain, so somewhere it can run off anywhere is where you don't want to think about it. Not next to a water body or a swale that's going to go. So stick it in the middle or on the high spot or something of that nature. As I was kind of talking about these well-drained soils, there is a difference between having a linden, sandy silt, sandy soil that's going to go right down versus you just have a sand patch that's your high spot. The sand patch is all right because likely there's a clay lens under there that's going to stop it. So it's when you have total soil type that's well-drained that we don't want to see that. Here's a couple other pictures of that. Here's actually someone who's got all of these piles out here. This is the field. This is a river over here. Yes, it's diked up, but this is a permanent source. There's always piles out here year-round. That's not okay neither, because these piles are going to just be around, and you're going to have conversion and losses, and every time you move them, it's like composting essentially. So if you have a permanent pile somewhere, then you need to have a permanent structure for that to be on. You want a compacted pad, concrete, etc. If you have a temporary storage less than 300 days, essentially, then you're okay to follow this guidance. So you just want to make sure, even though everything else is great, it's on the high spot, it's not going anywhere, that's a permanent storage facility, and it has a very different set of guidelines so we can be protective year-round. So otherwise, this is a good example of a large pile out in a field. A lot of times you just see like this small little pile, a long row of it. That's not what you want to see. You want to see nice big piles. What you do want to be, and here's kind of the same, what you do want to be concerned about, so like in a picture like this, for instance, you kind of see the piles and you see kind of this more driveway with all these ruts and water. Well, this may not be, actually in this picture, it's not a problem at all because it's not going anywhere. But what you want to make sure is that even though these two things seem a long distance away, that 100 feet or so, if you've got a direct conduit, let's say there was a ditch down here, then it can be a problem. So you still have pathogens or nutrients or sediments and stuff, and you don't want that going in. This is a bit of a lot of graph here, but I just want to use it to iterate a point here. And what we're looking at, this is July through June on the bottom graph, and you can see that this line here is your soil nitrate. So you can see that it peaks around September time period. So we get kind of the peak of that at this time, and this plays back to when do we have the most nitrate availability and when are we utilizing it the most. And then this yellow line is our precipitation line. So if it's out there and now you have a way for it to go somewhere, you can see that we have a potential loss factor there. So you've got crop utilization, which is you want to kind of match up with those things. Our groundwater nitrate is opposite of our soil nitrate, so and this is based on real data, by the way, I just smoothed it out. So you can see that as we oh look, our soil nitrate's disappearing, where's it going? It's going to the groundwater nitrate. So it does move around like that, as well as our groundwater depth kind of comes up, and those two things kind of sequentially go away with each other. Our soil temperature also plays into that. As that decreases, then we have less uptake, and that's why we get a spike in our groundwater as well. So that's kind of those high spots. And what these markers also show, this is when you want to stop putting nutrients out because you know you're going to have a lot available still, and that this January time period, February time period, you're all right. We're not so concerned at all really with leaching potential, those types of things. It's more of a runoff issue that time of year. And this is just an example of our precipitation and when application ends up being good and how we need to adjust on a yearly basis. So the top line is 2012, the bottom is 2011. The red line represents half an inch of rain, so this is absolutely no application if you've got a rain event over that. And it starts in January here and goes through our current time period right now, and that's inches on the other end. So you can see that as we go through the year, So this year we had some windows in that early season, some in February, but it got really challenging for a while. And then you had kind of these windows and we had a long dry period, and now it's been challenging. After I think it was October 15th, it started raining and it hasn't stopped. And so any application after that was a higher risk application. Last year, a little bit different. We had a lot of small rain events in the early season, nothing too serious. We had a lot actually, so this spike, this is what shows that even looking at that manure spreading advisory in August, in June, July, August is still important, because we can have an event that's going to cause a lot of movement. A lot of times that time of year your soil's going to take it up and it's not going to be a problem, but it's always nice to consider and think about those things. If you can just delay a day or two to keep yourself out of trouble, it's probably a good idea. And then we didn't have as much, we had small rain events kind of all the way through our October time period last year, but you can see every year, no matter what, kind of the end of September time period, that's when it just starts raining, it just starts moving stuff around wherever it wants to go. So we also get weird dry periods in December. This December, not so much, but a lot of them are that way. So it's really important that this kind of just exemplifies why we want to be able to look at these things on a daily basis throughout the year and figure out what field and where you want to go. I think, yeah, that just shows kind of the typical February 15th time period and why that's not a good idea. So February 15th this year, we had a lot of big rain right after that. Had we scooted that back a couple weeks, it was totally fun. You would have had a nice dry period for that. So last year was a little bit different. It's kind of the opposite. So just kind of showing those things when we want to stop each year changes a little bit as well. And this can be shown with, this is kind of data from, this is precipitation 2009, and then these are fecal coliform counts that are taken around the county. So you can see that this was February 15th and we had a spike in fecal coliform in a handful of areas. So there's a little bit of a correlation sometimes, and we had a bit of a rain event after that. Versus other times of the year, it stays pretty low if we are all doing a good job out there. So what this accounts for, so I'm talking about all of this, let's shift to ending in September versus October. It's just better practice all around, but you're thinking, well, that's another month of storage or more I may have to collect, and I'm not okay with that. Well, you could be okay with it if you're doing a really good job with your clean water management. So just collecting a little bit of clean water can start to make a big difference. If you have one broken gutter, you can collect quite a bit of water. For instance, just looking at an area that's 100 by 100, so not even that large, that's about 6,000 gallons with 1 inch. If you look at 30 inches of rain, which is what we typically get during the storage period, that's 187,000 gallons that you've collected off that small area. So if you have a roof that's 3 times that size, plus a little bit of slab, plus this, plus that, it starts to really add up. You could collect an extra month of storage if you've got a roof panel missing, a gutter broken, a slab area that you could easily have kind of between barns, you could put a roof over and diverted, or that gutter kind of broke off and you're having issues on your downspouts, whatever it may be, your driveway is not diverted correctly. Your slab is collecting all the year, or your silage is collecting all year versus just a couple months of the year. So there are a lot of ways that you can minimize your clean water. If you're already doing a fantastic job and you're already maxed out on storage every year, maybe you need another storage vessel. So there are ways to kind of to look at really minimizing these and doing this. So part of what we're going to try to start doing for folks is doing, upon request, doing these clean water evaluations. How much clean water are you collecting on your farm, and how are ways that we can help you minimize that? So, and it's good, you do not want to be hauling water, it's expensive, and you don't want a really dilute lagoon in your early season. You want to be putting on your thickest stuff possible in the early year. You don't want to be putting on really dilute thin stuff in the majority of cases. So this is important to think about. And here, this just shows a lot of people think, well, man, we've had a lot of rain this year, or we had a lot last year, etc. So this is on our website. You can look at this, and this is generalized for Linden, but the pattern is the same. The total volume is just a little bit different. And this shows generally annual rainfall for Linden, Sumas, Acme, and Ferndale, so you can kind of see that. And by year, you can see the differences. And what I've highlighted here which didn't come out very well, is kind of October, November, December, and then January, February, March as the 6-month storage period, and that's this value down here. So on average, you can see that we collect approximately the same amount of water every year during that storm, or during that period. It just comes on different months. Like, for instance, this year, we had 0 in September. We had like 9 inches in October, whereas a couple of years ago, we had 6 inches in September and 2 in October. You know, so you never know when it's going to come, and we've kind of had a lot, you know, in the last 3 months, to be honest with you. But so it is. Those are things to consider when managing your storage as well. And when does this rain come? It felt like we had more this year than last, or we had dry periods, and suddenly everyone felt like we had a drought. But no, we're about right. So we'll probably be a little above average for the total year once the end of December is done. So this is a nice way just to consider that. If you're curious about your own rainfall, we have rain gauges here, so they're in the back. We've got about 16 of them or so. And if you want to pick up one, they're free. All we ask is that you actually monitor that and log your data. And there's a site called COCORAS, I'm going to say. It's the Community Cooperative Rain and Hail Network. And they basically, it's just a repository that you can every day just log your rainfall in there, and then you're able to see your own stats and all that information. And it's actually a national map, and then you can par that down to Washington and then look at just your area. And it's kind of cool. This is today's. I pulled it up this morning, and it shows these are all the folks, the volunteers who are collecting rain in their area and who do post it. You don't have to. It's just kind of a nice thing to do because researchers all over use this data for predicting weather patterns. But you can see the variation between 0.1 to 0.65 to 0.5 to 0.23. Depending on where you live in the county, there's a huge variability. And so if you're aware of how much rain you get at your place by taking this rain gauge and just writing it down each day, it'll kind of help you gauge your collection, like how much rain am I collecting, you know, this month or whenever, and you can kind of gauge how much storage am I going to need and clean water collection and all those types of things. It helps you with your irrigation. How much water have I had this month? How much do I need to put on? So just having a simple rain gauge, put it somewhere where you'll see it every day, let your kids do it, or use it as a learning opportunity, whatever you want to do. They're pretty cool to have. So they're first come, first served basis. If we run out, just let me know and I can get another one for you as well. So kind of a cool thing to have, just a little tool. So the last thing in here I want to talk about is the manure setback distances. And this is something that we revised in this last year. So setback distances we're using now in lieu of the historical filter strips, the big dumb buffers that everyone has been required to have. So that 35-foot or whatever it may be that you need to have near streams. If you can manage effectively using a setback and you're doing a good job, then that's what you need. If you can't, or you need more protection, then those filter strips need to go into play. So this is kind of your first opportunity that if you can just use setback distances, you can do a good job. And this is typically on your grass fields, which that edge acts as a buffer for the most part anyway, acts as that filter strip piece. And what we did, this is largely based on scientific evaluation and other studies that have been done. We kind of gathered all the information out there and what's best and what distances for what type of control are we looking for. And then we took those values and we kind of, instead of 51.6 feet or something like that, we kind of rounded up and rounded down. And so what you're going to see here is throughout the year, you're going to have a variable distance. So January, February, that's going to be 80 feet back from any kind of a water body or swale or other area that we've said kind of can run off. And then come March, that decreases to 40 feet. We still get a lot of rain and we still want to keep a little bit of a distance from that area. And then come April, it says 40-10 here. And we still want to maintain, we can still get a lot of rain in April, May, June actually. So you still want to be 40 feet back. If we're going to have a lot of rain, you're on a grass field. If you're on a cornfield and you're injecting, you can be up to 10 feet if your buffer and that side edge is looking good. So, and then we decrease that distance to 10 feet, May, June, July, August. So you're able to apply effectively right up to the edge. Except if you have a big gun, if you're using a big gun, you must at minimum always be 40 feet back. And that's because of drift, because you will end up 10 feet from a water body or other area when you use those. They tend to drift quite a bit. And then come September, that bumps back up to 40 feet. This is interesting. So if we think back a couple slides, that precipitation, this year we were bone dry through September. The year before we had a bit of rain. So this is another one, just like April, it's a little bit variable. So there might be times where you can go a little bit closer, but just always remember that it takes, if we're thinking about pathogens here, it can take a while for those to die off. Once you spread them out there, it's usually sunlight or warmth or soil mechanisms that kind of break those down and make them not a problem. But if we're going to get, if it's really cold, those can persist to October when we get a lot of rain. So that's why we kind of start kicking that back around that time. October, November, December, October, it's now 80 feet. This is a little bit different than older plans. And by the way, older plans, everyone's plans is something a little bit different here and there and everywhere. So this is now universal guidance for everybody as we kind of get plans updated, or just in general, this is now the new guidance. But while it does bump to 80 feet in October and it feels, it's 80 feet in February, it still feels a little bit wide. Giving you this ability to go a lot closer in the summertime, it all equals out. You're going to have plenty of nutrients out there in that edge at the end of the year. And in the beginning, we still have such saturated soils and risk that this is really going to minimize your potential losses. So just following this guidance and doing a good job with that is going to make a huge impact for having less nutrients, sediment, and or pathogens that reach our waterways. And I think collectively, if everyone did this, you'd notice a big difference. It's kind of, if everyone does a little bit, it compiles and really makes a good difference. And this applies both to solid and liquid applications, so they're treated the same. And that's important to consider. Yeah, so those are those variables. And then just a brief, so our new dairy plan format, as I was mentioning, now all of our plan guidance, so if you think about that big binder you have and there's various sections, everything after maps, all of that O&M and guidance, it's now all online. So it is now, we've got a lot more information from you. We've got links to new and interesting things and studies, and if you want to learn more, we've got all that up there then. So this is a way that we can get you so much more information. So we've got, your manure management, land management, nutrient testing, calibration, record keeping. If you're like, oh man, what test am I supposed to take? If you go online, you're always going to have the most recent up-to-date stuff. You can't find your plan, or you're not sure if it's actually up-to-date or right. Everything online is now up-to-date. And this is a way that once we've got everyone and kind of getting you to this point, we call these type 1 updates now, where we can just get you, do your WSP, make sure your nutrient balance is still looking good, get you some new maps if that's necessary, do this new risk evaluation for all your fields and kind of get you on a custom application schedule, and then get you on this new guidance. That alone is kind of a type 1 update. If you on top of that want to put in a new lagoon, or you want cost share, or you want some other things, then we kind of go to a type 2 plan where we can do more. So these type 1 plans are very accessible, and it'll get everyone on the same guidance, which is good in a lot of different respects for a lot of different people, a lot of different reasons, but mostly for you guys to be consistent. And also have customization within there for you. So a lot of new information, and as I mentioned, all that stuff, the application risk management stuff's online with the worksheet, the manure setbacks are there, manure transfer. So if you need waste transfer agreements, you're sending a little bit or taking a little bit, you need to keep records of that for the inspector. They want to see those. You can just go right here, print it out. It's a fillable form, have you sign it, and just put it in your plan. You've got those records. So, and when you do your nutrient update, it helps us know how much you're importing or exporting, so we can account for that and give you credit for that in your budget. Information about the speaker series is also on here, as I mentioned. The Manure Spreading Advisory is there. A weather summary is also there, so you can go to links. I've got some really, really neat weather links that are on there that give you 4-hour blocks of precipitation for 4 days out, as well as temperature and freezing. And I mean, it's just a really, really neat, NOAA hosts that. And it's just a really, really neat tool to be able to use for farmers. Look at that every day and just be able to plan your day. It's great. So that's kind of that, and getting your plans updated in this format will be really helpful for everybody. And then, as you guys may get these, we're doing newsletters, and we've got the webpage, targeting mailings on hot topics, innovative decision tools, as I mentioned, having these meetings. Hopefully all of these things together keeps you guys kind of informed and allows us to get new, exciting information to you. We've got research projects coming up, and we want people to participate. It's a way that we can kind of get out there, and you can volunteer. You get a ton of really neat information on your farm, and you kind of help us develop better guidance and tools for everybody as a whole. So it's a nice way to kind of get to you guys for all of those various things. And then the last thing here, this watershed map. So this goes back, as I was mentioning, like the fecal coliform, and how do you know if your watershed's good, or is there a problem right now, or all that. Well, on our webpage, we also every month update. So there's fecal coliform measured, all these red dots, this is our county. All the red dots throughout the county are measured every month, and we get that data from, it's a kind of the area group of Wire One, Department of Ecology, I guess the Nooksack Indian College kind of takes the data, etc. So there's a lot of folks involved in that, and so we just put up the map every month. We put the data in there, and so you can see your watershed. Green is good, red is bad. So you'll have an idea of, you know, if you're who in my area is not, you know, kind of go out and a little bit of a peer review, or just to say, hey, look, it's looking great right now. And actually, if you pulled it up right now, our fecal coliform levels are very low, which is to be expected this time of year. So it looks good. And yeah, the speaker series, and that's it. So there's a lot of stuff there, but the big ones to remember are your agronomic rate, and I've got a handout so you don't have to forget any of this. Your agronomic rates and agronomic rate, determining that, looking at that manure spreading advisory, filling out that ARM worksheet. Once we've kind of done that whole assessment for you, doing your fields and all that, something we'll get for you in the office, and then following the manure setback guidance, and you should really help minimize having any issues while also applying your manure at a time where you're going to increase your yields. There's one thing I didn't mention is actually in the farms that are cutting back early and applying early, we've seen an increase in yields in grass in those. So it's actually a real positive thing. And this also applies for folks who are grazing. This actually same guidance for grazing as well. So you want to maintain those setbacks because you're applying manure at a smaller rate, but you're still putting it out there. So that's something to consider.